Shooters who fired dozens of shots, perhaps more than 50. Remarkably, all of those bullets missed a baby who was sitting in the car that was targeted.
They called it a miracle. Over 50 bullets ripped through that car in broad daylight, glass shattered, metal torn apart, and somehow a 13-month-old baby walked away without a single injury. Not a scratch. But here's what no one seems to be saying. Miracles don't answer questions. Because a 26-year-old mother is gone, a man in that same car was shot but survived, and 3 gunmen opened fire and disappeared. So what was this really about? What kind of conflict leads to that level of violence? In the middle of the day, with a baby sitting in the back seat. Because what makes this case even more disturbing isn't just the number of shots fired. It's the question no one could answer that day. Who were they really aiming for? Before we get into this, make sure you subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? Gabryel Ayers was living a life that, to the outside world, looked familiar. She was 26 years old, a young woman still figuring things out, still building her future, one day at a time. But more than anything, she was a mother. Her days weren't centered around herself anymore. They revolved around her baby girl, feeding times, quiet moments, small routines that only mothers truly understand. The kind of life where sleep becomes a luxury, and every decision carries a different kind of weight. Responsibility wasn't optional anymore, it was constant. People who knew Gabryel described her as social, someone who stayed connected with those around her. She wasn't isolated. She had family. She had people in her corner. After her death, one of the voices that spoke out publicly was her godfather. Someone who clearly cared deeply about her. Someone who felt the loss in a very real way. Because in many cases like this, people assume the victim was alone or disconnected. But that wasn't her story. Gabryel was present. She was part of a circle. She had relationships, conversations, interactions, like anyone else her age, navigating life, friendships, and motherhood all at once. And then there was her child. A baby girl who depended on her for everything. At that age, a mother isn't just important, she's the entire world. Every cry, every moment of comfort, every sense of safety begins with her. Gabryel wasn't just raising a child, she was shaping a life, building a bond that only grows stronger with time. That's what makes this case hit differently. Because when a life like that is cut short, it doesn't just end one story. It disrupts another that had barely begun. We don't have detailed public records of every part of Gabryel's past, and that matters, because it reminds us that not everything about her life was meant for headlines. Some parts belonged to her family, her close circle, the people who knew her beyond a name on a screen. But what we do know is enough to understand this. She wasn't just a victim. She wasn't just a woman in a car. She was a mother, navigating a stage of life that demands patience, sacrifice, and constant presence. So how does someone like her end up in the middle of something this violent? The day began as usual. It was just another drive. Gabryel Ayers was in the passenger seat of a vehicle moving through a neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. Behind the wheel was a 27-year-old man. In the back seat, secured in place, was her baby girl. 3 lives inside one car. The vehicle continued moving, passing through streets where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No sudden stops, no clear indication that they were being followed or watched. At least none that anyone has publicly confirmed. Was this moment truly random, or had something already been set in motion? There's no confirmed timeline that shows exactly when the danger began. No clear point where everything started to go wrong. But what is known is this: at some point during that drive, their vehicle became the focus of something deliberate. 3 shooters sprang out to the road, and then, without warning, the first shot rang out, sharp, sudden, impossible to ignore. Before there was time to react, more followed, one after another, rapid, relentless. Gunfire tore into the vehicle from outside, bullets ripping through metal and glass, as if the car offered no protection at all. The sound alone would have been overwhelming, loud enough to drown out everything else, loud enough to send immediate panic through anyone inside. The driver instinctively tried to keep control, but it was already slipping. The car jolted as rounds struck from multiple directions. Windows shattered inward. Fragments scattered across the seats. Visibility dropped in seconds. There was no time to process what was happening. No time to think, only instinct. Gabryel was in the passenger seat when the bullets started hitting her. Not once, not twice, multiple times. Each impact pulling her further from any chance of escape. The violence wasn't brief, it continued, wave after wave, as the attackers kept firing. Over 50 shots. That number alone says everything. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't random. This was sustained, overwhelming force directed at one vehicle. Inside, everything turned into chaos. The driver, now also hit, struggled to keep the car on the road. Hands shaking, body reacting, trying to steer through something no one could realistically control. The vehicle veered, tires scraping against the pavement as it lost direction. And still, the shooters didn't stop immediately. In the front seat, Gabryel had taken the worst of it. The extent of her injuries was severe, the kind that leaves little room for recovery in a moment like this. She was critically wounded, her body bearing the impact of an attack that never should have happened. Just feet behind her. Something almost impossible. Her baby, still alive. Not struck, not injured. In the middle of more than 50 rounds being fired into that vehicle, the child in the back seat was untouched. That contrast is what makes this moment so difficult to process. 2 lives in the same car. One devastated by violence, the other somehow shielded from it. It doesn't make sense. And yet, that's exactly what happened. The driver, injured but alive, remained inside the wreckage. The scene around them quickly began to draw attention, people nearby realizing something had just taken place, something far beyond a normal crash. Because this wasn't just an accident. It was an attack. The kind that leaves behind more questions than answers. Why this car? Why this moment? Why so many shots? And most importantly, who were they aiming for? Because when you step back and look at it, the number of rounds, the intensity, the focus, it becomes harder to believe this was random. There was intent behind it, there was a purpose. And whatever that purpose was, it didn't end the way it was expected to. A baby survived, a mother didn't. And that imbalance forces a question that refuses to go away. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. For a moment after the crash, everything felt suspended. The gunfire had stopped, but the weight of what just happened hadn't. The car sat damaged and still, its windows shattered, its body marked by dozens of bullet holes. Inside, there was no clear sense of order, only the immediate aftermath of something violent and overwhelming. Then came the response. Calls had already gone out, reports of shots fired, a vehicle struck, people inside. Emergency crews moved in quickly, approaching a scene that was already drawing attention. What they found inside the car wasn't just the result of a crash. It was the result of an attack that had unfolded in seconds, but left lasting damage. Gabryel Ayers was pulled from the passenger side. Her condition was critical. There was no time to wait. No room for delay. She was rushed to the hospital, where medical teams worked to stabilize her, doing everything they could to counter the injuries she had sustained. But the damage was severe. Despite those efforts, she didn't survive. The driver, also shot, was treated for his injuries. He lived. And then there was the baby, still in the back seat, still alive. When first responders reached her, there were no visible injuries, no signs that she had been physically harmed in the middle of everything that had just happened. In a situation where over 50 rounds had been fired into the same vehicle, that outcome feels almost impossible. But it was real. She survived completely unharmed. And that detail changed how people saw this case, because it created a contrast that's difficult to explain. The scene itself didn't offer answers. It only reinforced the scale of what had taken place. A targeted burst of violence concentrated on a single vehicle. In the middle of the day, people nearby were left trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Not just the sound of gunfire, but the reality of it. The fact that a mother had been killed, while her child, sitting just feet away, survived without a single injury. Because it doesn't follow logic. It doesn't feel balanced. It raises questions that don't have immediate answers. Why did this happen the way it did? And as the scene cleared, and the immediate urgency gave way to investigation, one thing became more and more apparent. This wasn't something that just happened. It was something that was meant to happen. But even then, something about it didn't add up. When you step back from the chaos of what happened, one detail stands out more than anything else. Over 50 rounds were fired into that car. Because incidents like this don't just happen without intent. But here's where things begin to feel complicated. There hasn't been a clear, publicly confirmed explanation of why Gabryel Ayers would be the focus of something like this. No widely established motive tied directly to her. No definitive statement that places her at the center of a known conflict. And that absence of clarity opens the door to a different possibility. Because in situations like this, it's not always the person who is hit who is meant to be. Sometimes it's about proximity. Gabryel wasn't alone in that car. She was with a 27-year-old man who was driving. He was also shot, but he survived. And while there are no confirmed public details fully explaining his connection to the attack, his presence becomes an important part of the conversation. Because when a vehicle is targeted with that level of intensity, investigators don't just ask what happened, they ask who was meant to be inside. And that leads to a question that shifts everything. What if she wasn't the target at all? It's a difficult thought, but one that can't be ignored. Because if the attack was aimed at someone else in that vehicle, if the intention was directed toward the driver or another perceived target, then Gabryel's presence in that moment placed her directly in harm's way. And that possibility is what makes this case even more unsettling. It suggests that sometimes the difference between safety and tragedy comes down to timing and association. There are also broader factors to consider. Incidents like this don't exist in isolation. They are often connected to environments where conflicts can escalate quickly, where disputes, whether personal or external, can move beyond words. But without confirmed details, those connections remain questions, not conclusions. And that's important, because the facts we do have already tell a powerful story. A specific vehicle was attacked, dozens of rounds were fired. Multiple people inside were hit. That alone points towards something intentional. So now the question turns to you. Do you think she was the intended target, or just in the wrong place at the wrong time? When you look at this case beyond the surface, it starts to follow a pattern that has shown up in other incidents like it. Situations where the level of force used doesn't match randomness. Over 50 rounds fired into a single vehicle. That kind of attack usually points to one thing: focus. Not a stray encounter, not a brief confrontation, but a moment where a specific target was in mind and everything else became secondary. And that's where cases like this become more complex. Because sometimes, the person who loses their life isn't the one the violence was originally meant for. It's a difficult reality, but it has happened before. There are situations where someone becomes a victim simply because they were close to the intended target, sitting next to them, riding with them, or even just being in the same place at the wrong time. In those moments, proximity becomes the deciding factor. In this case, Gabryel Ayers was in the passenger seat. The driver, a 27-year-old man, was also struck, but survived. And while there's no confirmed public explanation tying him directly to the motive behind the attack, his presence introduces a layer that can't be ignored. Because when a vehicle is hit with that level of intensity, it raises a key question. Was the focus on the car or on someone inside it? And if it was someone inside, who? That uncertainty is what keeps this case open in a different way. Not just as a tragic loss, but as something that doesn't fully align with what we expect from a random act. There's also the environment to consider. Incidents like this often happen in places where conflicts can escalate quickly, where disagreements, tensions, or past issues can carry over into public spaces. And when that happens, the line between private conflict and public danger disappears. A street becomes a scene. A routine drive becomes a target. But even in those environments, something about this case stands out. The number of shots, the timing, the fact that a baby was inside the vehicle. Those details don't just point to violence. They point to a moment where consequences were either ignored or didn't matter to whoever carried it out. And that leads to a deeper reflection. That idea shifts how you look at situations like this. Because it means risk isn't always obvious. It doesn't always come with warning signs that are easy to recognize. Sometimes it exists quietly in the background, attached to people, places, or circumstances that don't immediately feel dangerous. And then, in a single moment, it becomes real. Gabryel's presence in that car placed her directly in the path of something that may not have started with her, but ended with her. And that's what makes this case so difficult to process. Because if she wasn't the intended target, then her loss becomes even harder to explain. Not because it lacks reason, but because the reason may have had nothing to do with her at all. Which brings the focus back to the same question that keeps resurfacing. What really happened here? After the scene was cleared and the noise faded, what remained was something far heavier than the violence itself: loss that couldn't be reversed. For Gabryel Ayers' family, the reality didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves. First the call, then the confirmation, and then the weight of understanding that she wasn't coming back. She was 26, a daughter, a friend, a mother, and now, a name attached to something that should never have happened. Grief in moments like this isn't simple. It doesn't move in a straight line. It comes with questions, with disbelief, with a kind of silence that settles in when there are no answers that make sense. One of the voices that captured that pain was her godfather. He didn't speak in complicated terms. He didn't try to explain what couldn't be explained. Instead, he asked a question that cut straight through everything else. Why shoot at a car, knowing there was a baby inside? It's a question that stays with you. Because it forces you to confront not just what happened, but the mindset behind it. The idea that, in that moment, whoever carried out the attack either didn't know or didn't care. And that's what makes it harder to process. This wasn't an isolated space. This wasn't a situation hidden from view. This happened in the middle of the day, in a place where life was moving as usual. And yet, in seconds, it became the center of something devastating. For her family, the grief is personal, but it's also ongoing, because there's a child at the center of this story. A baby who survived something she will one day have to understand. Right now, she won't remember the sound of gunfire. She won't remember the crash. She won't remember the moment everything changed. But she will grow up knowing the outcome. She will grow up without her mother. And that absence doesn't fade. It becomes part of everyday life. In milestones that should have been shared. In moments that should have included guidance, comfort, presence. That's the part of this story that extends beyond the day it happened. Because while the violence ended in seconds, the impact didn't. It carried forward, into the lives of the people who knew Gabryel, and especially into the life of the child she left behind. A child who survived the unthinkable, but now has to live with what was lost. Paying attention to environments. Not ignoring situations that feel off. Understanding that conflict doesn't always stay contained, it can escalate, and when it does, it doesn't always affect just the people directly involved. We're also living in a time where disagreements don't just happen face to face. They happen through messages, posts, conversations that can quickly intensify. And while not every conflict leads to violence, some do move beyond words. That escalation, whether offline or through digital interactions, can carry consequences that go far beyond what anyone initially expects. And the reality is, once it reaches that level, it doesn't pause to consider who else might be affected. That's why cases like this matter. Not just as stories, but as reminders. Reminders that safety isn't always about what you're doing, but also about what's happening around you. So let me ask you this. Have you ever ignored a situation that later felt dangerous? And do you think situations like this can be prevented? Or are some moments simply beyond control? Because those questions don't have easy answers. But thinking about them might make a difference. When you go back to the beginning of this story, it still feels almost impossible to process. Over 50 shots fired. A car torn apart in seconds. A young mother caught in the middle of it. And a baby in the back seat. Still alive, that contrast doesn't fade, it stays with you, because it challenges what we expect from moments like this. One life taken, one life spared, in the exact same space. And as everything settles, as the noise of what happened gives way to silence, one question continues to stand above all the rest. Maybe the most haunting question isn't who pulled the trigger, but who they were really aiming for. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because these stories deserve to be told.